operations planning. These are complementary products. Neither one requires the other one. However, they do work together pretty well. The forecasting application is primarily intended to help with the demand planning process in that it calculates forecasts that drive the SyteLine APS planning system. It is primarily working with forecasting at the item level in unit quantities, but it also can be at the customer or warehouse level. Sales and operations planning typically includes a forecasting material planning process, but it also is much bigger. And the bigger aspect of sales and operations planning is that it's about setting goals and managing attainment towards those goals and dealing with all of the obstacles that come along to accomplishing your company-wide goals. So we'll as I go through the presentation today, I'm going to start off with just some concepts, some screenshots, just explaining how these two different applications work, where they fit, what problems they might help address, and then we'll get into the actual software and show how they work. Both these applications have been developed in Mongoose. They're developed specifically for SyteLine. They're available through Infor. You have to buy them through Infor, and when they're installed, they just become part of the SyteLine system, as if they, were part of the core product. Right? They're in the same menus, use the same database. So we really refer to these more as add-in applications because there's really no interfacing. It all just becomes part of SyteLine. Now, the forecasting application, where it might fit or why it might help your company, is if you hear comments around the company like, we need to decrease our shortages in our late shipments. Our inventory is growing out of control. But when we try to forecast, we really feel like it's just guesswork, and we're really not getting very good at it, and it just takes a whole lot of time. Well, the purpose of this application is to address those things in that it helps you right-size your inventory and develop a efficient, organized, repeatable approach to forecasting your material demand, as opposed to just the more manual spreadsheet approach that we see in most companies. First thing to decide in implementing this application for automating your forecasting process is to decide how you want to forecast and what you want to forecast. What I mean by how is there's generally three types of methods that are supported here. One is the statistical approach, and this is where you use a statistical model, an algorithm that looks at historical sales or usage and then predicts the future based on patterns in the past. The second method is a roll-up, or sometimes referred to as consensus building forecast, and that's where maybe you start at the customer level or the sales rep level or even warehouse level, and you develop those level forecasts and then roll them up to the higher levels to where you have totals for your items. And then finally, it's just kind of the opposite of a roll-up. It's more of a top-down, and that's for companies where really the forecasting process is usually more driven by sales, marketing, upper management, where you're working with groups of products and dollarized sales plans, and then those plans need to be disaggregated down into a item-level material forecast. Now, you can pick and choose and combine these different methods, by the way. You don't have to stick with just one. Then once you know how you're going to forecast, you would decide what you want to forecast. For some companies that sell catalog-type items, make-to-stock type items, then forecasting the sellable items that actually appear on customer orders, is certainly the easiest approach. This works with standard SyteLine in the sense that standard SyteLine consumes forecasts at the sellable item level, but it stops there. So if you're like most companies that seem to use SyteLine, where you don't sell the same items over and over, you're a configure to order, engineer to order, maybe even make to order with options type of manufacturer, then you need to forecast what you buy as opposed to what you sell, since it's not the same things you're selling over and over. So this application allows you to forecast at the component level and consume that forecast at the component level. And then the final method referred to as planning bombs, planning bills and material. This is where you're allowed to forecast, well, it might typically be used for a configurable company where you have a family of products that have a lot of different options, and as opposed to taking the component forecasting approach, you'd like to forecast an entire model along with all of its options as a group. And this gives you some tools to group all the items of a family together and forecast them as a group, and then consume that forecast when members of the group are sold. So this is how the planning system in SyteLine works, and where this application, the forecasting application, fits into that. So you enter your demand in the system, and by that referring to the forecasts and the customer orders. Then you run the planning system, which explodes that demand through the bill of materials. It compares it against what you have on hand and what you're planning to make and buy. And then it applies what I call inventory drivers to the calculations, where it looks at what your desired safety stock levels are, your order mins, lead times. And then after it does all this number crunching, looking at all that data, it generates what we call a plan, or suggestions, if you will, of work orders and purchase orders that need to be released. And if you're using SyteLine already, then you're probably familiar with this, in that these plans are presented to you in what is called the Material Planner workbench, and you can look at those plans and drill down to the details as to how the plans were derived, and then make decisions about what you actually want to release. Well, this whole process here we call the material planning process, and where the application fits in is what I have in blue and underlined, in that it calculates the forecast, the safety stocks, and the order mins. Because standard SyteLine gives you a place to enter that data, but it doesn't give you any help at all with coming up with what should be entered there, and that's the purpose of this tool set. So I'll kind of highlight here how these different, how you forecast approaches work. So this one, the statistical forecasting, the system looks at the history that you have in SyteLine. Now that history can be your sales orders or your actual material transactions, and then it applies a statistical model. Maybe that's a seasonal model or a moving average model, a lot of different models to select from, and it looks at that history for however many months you tell it to look at, and then projects that into the future. Now it's your turn to come in and look at what the system has come up with and decide how you want to adjust that, because obviously you're going to have things that you know that the statistical model does not know. So you can do these adjustments either at group levels, like a family code, a product code, a planner code, those groupings that SyteLine uses to put the items into different categories. Or you can adjust at the individual item levels for things like if an item's going to be discontinued, or a particular product is going to have a price change that you think might affect the demand. So after you've done these calculations and the adjustments, you're in really a sandbox at this point, where you're just trying to get comfortable with this. And once you're happy with it and your adjustments, then you click a button and it loads all those forecasts into your planning system. The other approach I mentioned was collaborative or consensus type of forecasting. The example I have on this slide is where you would forecast by customer. Now this could be forecast by sales rep also, so kind of fill in the blank what that level is. So what I'm showing here is, let's say I have an item and I have 3 customers, could be 1, could be 10, but 3 that make up the bulk of the demand for this item. But then I also have other customers that will buy it. And what I want to do is, for these larger customers, I want to come up with a forecast for them through talking with the customer, talking with the sales reps, etc. And then I want to total those up for all the customers that I want to consensus forecast, along with a statistical forecast for all the other customers that I don't build a consensus forecast for. And I total all that up into a grand total for an item that then is loaded into the forecast system. Now, obviously, you might say, well, gee, that would be a lot of work, and so that's why we kind of lay this out where you can decide, which customers or sales reps or whatever that you would like to have a forecast for, and then the others can be done statistically. But that's kind of the idea behind this, is that you have something that's a very high dollar item, a very critical supply chain, and you really want to fine-tune your forecast for it, so you want to get multiple opinions. And that's the collaboration layer that you see in here, where you're able to say, ask the customer for a forecast, and then compare that to a statistically generated forecast, and then ask maybe the salesperson that manages that account for their opinion about the forecast. And you can look at all these together, make a decision about what a consensus forecast should be. And this slide just shows, how it could be customer that you're starting with, or it could be forecasting by warehouse or by sales rep, and the process still works the same. So kind of bringing it all together here, this process works probably a lot like if you do forecasting now. If you use spreadsheets to do that with, this mimics somewhat that process. However, it's integrated and automated and documented for how you come up with your forecasts. So most of our customers have a monthly forecasting cycle. Some do it weekly, but let's go with the assumption here that you're a company that revises your forecast once a month. So once a month, you would, in this application, you would collect your history, be that sales or usage history, in the application, and then you click one button, and for thousands of items, you can calculate all the safety stocks, all the forecasts for those items. Then you, while it's still in this sandbox, go in and analyze those forecasts. So we provide a lot of tools that I'll show you here in a moment to graph the forecast, group different items together, adjust the forecasts in different ways. And then once you're happy with what you've come up with, then you click a button and it loads all those forecasts into your planning system. And then finally, this application monitors those forecasts against what's actually happening, because since it might be once a month that you're going through this process, if you end up consuming your entire forecast, things don't go as planned, you might want to be alerted to that before the next forecasting cycle, and so the system does those alerts for you. Kind of a final point here is that you may be looking at this and going, well, gee, that sounds like that method might work for part of our company, and this method over here might work for another product line. So yes, you can combine these different methods. So you might have some items that are short lead time, inexpensive, easy to acquire, that you just want to manage with a reorder point. So this system will calculate the optimum reorder point for you using the standard APIX calculation. You may have some product lines where they are catalog type items. You sell the same items over and over again, so you want to use the sales history to forecast the items that will be on sales orders. For other product lines, it may be configurable or engineer to order, so you want to forecast the components. So you just pick and choose which one of these you want to use for different areas of the company, and they can be combined together into the total forecast that drives the planning system. So I'll go ahead and jump into the forecasting actual application now, and we'll come back and then talk about the SytePlan sales and operations planning. This is the home form for the forecasting application. What you see on the left is a list of all of the items that you have decided to forecast. This is not your entire item master. It's just those that you'll be calculating forecasts for. And if you go into the spreadsheet view here, you can see some of the data that's tracked. For instance, the different categories that the item belongs to. And the forecasting application gives you additional categories. Shows you things like your average usage, your average forecast, which statistical model is being used to forecast that item. So to drill in a little bit deeper, I'm going to pick the FA 20,000 bicycle. And as soon as I select that, it's going to automatically pop up with any notes I have in the system about adjustments I've made to the forecast. So in this case, this item is going to be discontinued in November, and I've made a notation to remind me of that when I come into this form that I've adjusted the forecast. And you'll see how that works down here in this bottom right corner. The blue column shows me what the system has calculated to be the forecast, and the green column shows me the net adjusted forecast that's loaded into the planning system. The difference between those two are the group level adjustments I mentioned and the item level. So for instance, like here in November, the system calculated that we would need 151 of these based on history. But this item belongs to groups that have a 22% increase applied to that calculation. And then there's an item adjustment that overrides it to 0, because remember, this item is going to be discontinued in November. So even though the system calculated a forecast, we've adjusted it so that 0 is what flows through the planning system. Another example here, say in February, we calculated 151 using the model. It's increased by 12% based on groups that it's a member of, and then the adjustment says multiply that by 1, which that means don't change it. So then I get 151 increased by 12%, gives me that 169. The group adjustments are fairly simple to enter in. There's just a simple little matrix that looks like this that has things like the product code, planner code, other user-defined groupings, and you can specify the member of the group and a reason. So here, for example, we're having a product promotion for everything in the FG100 product code, and we believe that'll increase demand by 10% through June, and then 20% through the end of the year. And so it just takes that information and rolls it up to this part of the form. You see here there's a graph to the left on the form that shows me my history and my forecast overlaid on the same graph. There's some more powerful graphs here that are you can select from different ones that are actually dumped into Excel for you. So for example, this one shows me 2 years of history and then my 12-month forecast. So you can see for the last 2 years, this item has definitely had some seasonality, but my forecast, for whatever reason, I've selected a horizontal model, which says, hey, take kind of what's been going on as an average in the past, but give me a flat forecast going forward. I'll show you one other one here. The history graph is kind of a nice scorecard, if you will, on how good of a job you've been doing forecasting this item. So it shows me 3 years of actual demand compared to what my forecast was over that same period. So the red is the forecast, and you can see I'm probably doing a pretty good job here of picking up the average demand over that time period, but I certainly am not picking up the fact that during the summer months we tend to have higher demand, and at the end of the year we usually get some large orders. I'll show you how we can play around with those models here in a moment. This part of the form shows me 5 years of history. It's kind of just a quick look history snapshot. There is a more powerful way to look at the history, and that's through this tool that we call sales analysis. And it's a drag and drop graphical sort of tool that lets you pick a range of dates that you want to analyze and then generate a interactive view. The default for this view is to show me over that time period the customers we sold to, and then if I explode a customer, it shows me what items were sold to that customer. And then whatever I highlight up above, it gives me a graph down below, and I can say I like a bar chart a little better. So whatever I say highlight here, see how it instantly paints a graph, instantly builds me a legend for what I'm highlighting. But as I said, this is interactive. So as I'm looking at this, I may decide that I don't really like to analyze sales by customer. We have so many. I really analyze by item. So I just move these icons around. Now I can see sales by item, and if I explode an item, then I see the customers that purchased it. Or you may say, well, we want to analyze by sales rep, or by territory, or by product line, or by fill in the blank. So you have the ability here to pick through all these different dimensions so that I could say, well, show me by type of customer. If I just drop that icon on here and I can get rid of, let's get rid of these. So now I have customer type, and if I explode that, I see who the customers were in that category. Or, I could, of course, drop on any of those dimensions. And this is interacting with the live SyteLine data, so this is real-time analysis that you're doing. Let's go to looking at how you calculate a forecast. Just we'll quickly review that. If you go to the Calculations tab for this item we've been looking at, you can see I've selected a horizontal model to get that flat forecast that we mentioned, and I've told the system to look back 12 months when it's looking at history and ignore everything before that. Now, I can come in here, and if I'm a statistician and understand what the difference is between a Holt Winters model and a moving average model and a trend seasonal model, I can pick and choose and see what different results I get. Or myself, I'm actually don't remember half of what I learned in, maybe not even 10% of what I learned in my college statistics class. So I'm going to let the system decide for me what the best model to use is by going with automatic selection. What happens in that situation is that it looks at all the different models, runs them for different settings, and it figures out what the best match to what happened in the past would be. And I expected that this would be the case, that it saw that there was seasonality in the past demand for this item, so it's ranking a seasonal model as the best one, and I'm going to accept its recommendation. Then it gives me a little warning. It says, hey, Steve, back on that form, you had 12 months of history selected for what you wanted to consider, and really if you're going to pick seasonal model, you really need to set that to at least 24 months to see the seasonal pattern. So I'll go along with that suggestion as well. And if we go back, now you'll see my forecast has been recalculated, and I can graph that. Now you'll notice that the red bars, which is my newly calculated forecast, that pattern is very close to the same pattern that happened over that last 2 years.
They're predictable.
Yeah. Also, there is the collaborative approach. I will give you a short overview of that. With this method, Obviously, again, there's more work to it, but with maybe you want to spend more time really getting a forecast right for those high dollar critical items. With the statistical method, you click one button and it calculates all of your forecasts for all of your items. With this one, you come in here and you actually tell it, well, for these, in my case, my example here is these 4 items I do want to manage through a collaborative process. And if I explode any one of the items, then I'll see that I've, for instance, this FA 10,000, that I have 2 large customers that I have developed forecasts for. If I go down and select one of those customers, then I can see all of this data that I've gathered to compare in coming up with my forecast. So I'm looking for, in this grid below, we're looking at that 2 years ago, what we sold this item to this customer 1 year ago, what my forecast was last year, a statistical calculation for just this customer, and then the customer gave me a forecast, the salesperson gave me a forecast, the product line manager gave me a forecast, and I've assigned weights to all of those, and the system has calculated for me a weighted forecast considering how much faith I want to put in each one of those data points. And then I, as the planner for this item, can decide to either go with just one of these opinions or go with the calculated, or I can even just come in here and say, well, based on my best judgment and looking at all this, I believe it should be this value, and type in your own. Now, you don't have to use all of this data. It could be that all you want to do is just capture your customer's forecast and a statistical forecast, and you can do just that and ignore the other fields. All of these labels are user definable, so instead of being manager input, it could be marketing input. So you decide what you want your comparisons to be. And then up above here, it graphs all of these different data points, and you can kind of pick and choose which components you want to have appearing in your graph by selecting them. And you're allowed to document everything that you're going through and deciding how you want to adjust and why you made what decisions. You can document at the item level when I select the item, at the customer level here when I select the customer, and even at the period level for the customer for the item, you can document notes and justifications. And there's a lot more tools here to help with automating some of this process, but won't be able to get into that detail today. The last thing I'll show here in the forecasting application before we go over to SytePlan is how the safety stock reorder point type calculations work. Also can be done in mass for thousands of items. The example I will give you here would be, let's say I want to calculate the safety stocks and reorder points for everything in my main warehouse, or it could be just a range of items in my warehouse. But I'll start off with the whole warehouse and say, let's look at this for warehouse main. And after I ran that query, it came back and showed me here all the items that I stock in main, since I didn't restrict it. And then it shows me all the factors it considered as it calculated the safety stock. So it's looking at the lead time with the vendor. It's looking at my desired service level. And what that means is, what percent of the time do I want to be, let me say that differently. What percent confidence do I want to have that I never run out of this item? So if I put in that I want to be 90% confident, it's going to suggest that I carry more inventory than if I tell it I only need to be 80% confident. It's also going to consider the variability in demand. We call that the mean average deviation, and what it's really about is, if you have an item that you always sell 100 of every single month, then you don't have to carry a lot of safety stock. But if one month you sell 10, the next month you sell 1,000, it's very hard to predict demand, so you need to carry more safety stock, so that is factored into the APIX calculation of coming up with reorder point and safety stock. So these numbers are crunched through our calculation, and it compares our calculated number here, in this case 142, to what's currently set in the system is 20. And then you can decide whether you want to go with the calculated number, or you can type in your own. And after you've reviewed these, you just check off the ones you agree with, or you can right-click, check off an entire range. And then you come back to this form and check Post to SyteLine. And it will look at all the items that you have approved with your check marks, and it will update the safety stock and reorder points for you. Just finally to point out here that when you select an item, that you get a lot more detailed information over here when you're in the main form as opposed to the spreadsheet view. Like it shows me here 18 months of usage history for this item. So I can see probably where my variability was coming from was in the past and not so much recently. In this graph here, it shows me what the effect on inventory would be depending on what service level I key into the system. So if I put in 80% is my desired service level, it's going to tell me 142 for safety stock, whereas if I want to be 99% confident I never run out, I'm going to need to carry 394 at safety stock. All right, let me jump back over to the PowerPoint here, and I'll jump into the SytePlan application. And now, of course, remember here at the end, we're going to leave some time for some questions. Now, SytePlan, Sales and Operations Planning, is, again, a plug-in application for SyteLine. It's designed specifically for the SyteLine ERP system. It doesn't work with any other ERP systems. And its purpose is to help a company implement a organized, repeatable sales and operations planning process. It's a set of tools to pick and choose from to help you with developing plans, managing attainment towards those plans, and identifying obstacles in the company towards accomplishing those plans. So if you hear things like, our system just records data, but we need to know how we're doing and what we need to fix. Our right hand doesn't seem to know what the left hand is doing. Our departments are not working together towards the company goals. We need to better manage our demand-supply balance. But all of that planning and analyzing is very difficult, time-consuming, and we have to do it in spreadsheets, so it just never seems to get done. Well, that is the purpose here, is this application helps you with bringing together more of a cross-functional team, sales, operations, planning, purchasing, into working together to establishing goals and managing that attainment. And these tools are great for when you have your weekly, monthly sales and operations planning meetings. These forms are designed to be interactive, where they can be projected up on a board and talked about among the team to what are our problems, why didn't we hit our goals, what's going to go wrong in the long run that might keep us from hitting our goals. So we designed the application generally after what the American Production and Inventory Control Society considers to be a sales and operations planning goals and guidelines, also the Institute on Business Forecasting. And it's generally around the area of maximizing customer fill rates, optimizing your inventory levels, and of course, maximizing profits. And doing that through kind of a four-prong approach. It's setting goals and tracking attainment, managing your supply chain, controlling your inventory, and managing your backlog. And really this process all starts with developing these plans and then conducting effective cross-functional meetings to identify the problems and resolve them. So these are the type of plans that SytePlan helps you with developing: a revenue plan, a gross margin plan, production units plan, and all three of these are multi-dimensional. And by that I mean the plan isn't just by item or by product line. It can be by territory, by product line, by customer type, by market. Like the sales analysis tool that I showed you a while ago, we have a tool here that pivots on all those multiple dimensions to help you with building a plan. Then there's also the ability to build a workforce, call it a headcount plan, a capacity plan, and then, of course, SyteLine with your materials demand plan, and this brings it all together. So to be a little bit more specific, what functions does SytePlan have that support that process? Well, if your process kind of follows, first let's build a multi-dimensional sales and margins plan. Then we have what's called the S&OP workbench, which lets you build what many companies might call a budget or a sales plan, and then gives you reporting tools that let you compare that plan to what's actually happened in multiple dimensions. Next is that you need tools that allow you to see if you're halfway through the month, what's your plan for the month, based on your plan, how are you going to perform by the end of the month based on where you are right now. So it's that staying on track set of tools and task management. Next is looking out farther than just the current month and seeing what inventory and demand supply type problems, capacity problems you might have beyond just the short term and planning for those. And then lastly is looking back. How did we do last month compared to our plan? What went wrong and what can we do to fix it going forward? This might look a little familiar to you. As I said, the S&OP workbench that you used to develop the sales plan and margin plan looks a lot like the sales analysis tool. And I'm just going to go show you how that works. This is the home page for SytePlan, and like the rest of SytePlan and the home pages, it gives you, links to the most common forms that you use within the application and some quick graphs, the ability to see some basic dashboard type things like comparing your forecast to your sales plan to what's actually happening, a monthly analysis of where demand versus supply stands right now, looking at your annual operating plan of this year versus last year, and then a task management system, which uses the standard SyteLine task management system, except for it expands it into working with groups and seeing goals across a group as opposed to just individual tasks. Now, as promised here, the SytePlan workbench is kind of the starting point for building the plans. You start off with a blank sheet of paper and say, I want to build a sales plan, or call it a revenue plan, or as Apex calls it, an annual operating plan. And I want to build that based on what's happened in the past. And so it may be the last 6 months of activity is what is the best indication of what will happen going forward, or maybe the last 2 years. I'm just going to use the example of, say, the last 9 months. And knowing where my data is, put in some dates here, that this 9-month period is what I want to use to build my starting point. And it looked at all that sales history and built for me this forecast of averages. Now, I told it to use, again, just horizontal or averages. We could have said, look at the seasonality over that time period and build a plan for me with seasonality. Or maybe I'm wanting my marketing people to build a revenue plan, and I'm wanting my material planners to build a material forecast, but I want to get the two groups working together. So I could say, well, go grab what's already in the forecasting application and use that as my starting point for what I want to build in my revenue plan. Well, once I have this established, just like the sales analysis tool, I can highlight to graph and build a legend. I can move this data around to see my plan in different ways. And I can have a rolled up plan or explode any category into seeing lower level details. So here I see, the FG100 product line, and then I can see the customers I'm thinking that will buy that, and then I can explode a customer and see what items. So see, I can get very detailed, or I can even completely, if I say, I would never want to plan at the item level or the customer level, I want to stick with product codes and customer types, then I could just have those two dimensions here and only plan at that level, but the system will automatically push that down to the lower level behind the scenes. I'm just not having to deal with it. So let's say here we've got this plan as my starting point, but of course I know things are going to happen differently next year than what happened in the past. For instance, I believe that we'll have 10% better overall sales across the company. So I could just come into this grand total for the whole company and say I want to multiply that by 1.1. Well, okay, I clicked wrong there. So I'm just going to put in a number here, change it, and as you'll see, when I changed my grand total, it changed every single number at every single level within my entire plan. It just basically bumped everything by 10% across the company, every dimension. So that would be a top-down change. Now, I may look at that and say, this was a new product line, the SAMTN, and I know we'll do a lot more than that since this will be the second year of selling that product. So I'm going to do a mid-level change in my plan. Now it took that change and pushed it across all of the months and all the customers and everything down through to those lower levels. I also could change any particular period. So if I know that we're expecting a large promotion in June, I could come into that period, bump up the numbers, and then it will only change all dimensions, but just for that period of June. And then I can do lower level changes. For instance, if I knew that, customer 1 is planning on opening a new location and we'll be purchasing all of our products across a particular product line to restock a store. Then I could come into just one customer for one particular period, put in that large order that I'm predicting, and then it would push that down to the lower levels of what that customer was buying. Or I could even go down to the lowest level if I knew that this customer was planning on purchasing just this one item, a large order in the month of August. So you see how these changes I make, whatever level I make them at, they either push them down to the lower levels or push them up to the higher levels, which carries over to the totals for the periods, the product lines, and the year. Now I can develop as many of these plans as I desire. I can go out as many years into the future as I desire. I can save them as what-if scenarios and compare what-if scenarios one against the other. And I can even develop multi-site plans in this method, and that one of the dimensions of this tool is the multi-site group. that you can pick from so that I could see a company-wide sales plan, even though within SyteLine typically you're working with one site at a time. So I said that's kind of the main part of developing a plan. Developing a headcount workforce plan works very much that same way. Let me kind of overview for you some of the rest of the SytePlan application kind of at the higher level. This is an example of the type of report you can get for comparing forecasts against actuals, sales plans against forecasts, one plan against another plan. So you pick what you want to compare against what other thing you want to compare it to for the period in the year, and then it builds for you a monthly, total by quarter, total by year, dollars and units plan, and then graphs it. So kind of a nice presentation tool for any sort of comparison. This is an example of one of the tools that's helpful for a weekly S&OP meeting with a cross-functional team. It kind of brings together the whole supply and demand picture on a single form with the ability to drill down into details and analyze cause-effect. I'll give a brief example here. First, let me break this down for you and to show you that the red part of the form is the demand and actuals as it stands this instant within SyteLine ERP. Then the supply plan compared to that, and then projections for, I'll say I'm at the 15th of the month, and we're trying to project what are our sales going to be at the end of the month based on what our current demand and supply plans are. So it uses that data to project my sales, to project where I'm going to have shortages by the end of the month, and project my inventory levels at the end of the month. So one way this might be used is, let's say, operations manager, and I'm in one of these supply and demand meetings, and I look at this and I notice at a group level of the FG100 product line, I see that we have a backlog problem. We've got 347 units that are due to be shipped in the backlog this month. That backlog indicates just orders to be shipped this month. But I can see here that we're going to be 72 short of filling that backlog on time. So then the production manager might then respond with, well, I don't see why this problem has come up. We had a plan to ship 258 units. You can see here what the plan was. And we're probably going to ship even more than that. We're going to ship 375 because we already shipped 100. We got 40 in finished goods that are ready to be shipped, and we got 235 that are due to be finished by the end of the month. So why do we have a problem if we've actually produced more than what our plan was? And if you drill down a little bit deeper, then sales will notice that, oh, I see what it is. We have a problem with forecast accuracy. We missed the forecast so far by 169 units, so sales sold a lot more than what we had forecasted, and that's what's ended up causing our problem. And the solution to that, of course, is that we're going to have to find a way to expedite these 72 units between now and the end of the month, or else we're going to have some past due items. So if the forecast was the problem that caused that, then let's drill down into the forecast a little bit and see maybe if we have any indication of why the forecast maybe was wrong. We have here on this form called a stagger chart where we compare our sales plan to the forecast to what actually happened. And in this case, it's showing me how the forecast changed over time. So for the month of April, back in January, we forecasted 1. In February, we changed it to 234. In March, we changed our forecast to 662. So this forecast is changing way too rapidly for our supply chain to be able to respond to it. And we just need to get that forecast under control. This is one of the projection forms that looks out into the future, either in units or dollars, and projects what our inventory is going to be by item or by group in weekly buckets or monthly buckets. So again, it brings together the demand plan, supply plan, all on one form, and then shows me the projected inventory level in units or dollars, and then shows me at that point in time how many weeks of supply of inventory that inventory level is. We do rough cut capacity planning here to see whether the forecast is even reasonable considering our head count. In this view, we're using the resource groups and using the planning data that's in SyteLine to see how many hours or what head count is required by each one of our resource groups over a period of months out into the future. We have some nice drill-down tools for on-time delivery performance in SytePlan that allows you to look at vendor delivery performance as well as your delivery performance. Both forms look exactly the same. One has customer data, one has vendor data, but it shows you the on-time delivery percentages over time and then allows you to drill down into the time periods to see the actual orders. This is an expansion of that drag and drop graphical interactive tool. This one allows you to analyze your sales versus your forecast, or allows you to analyze a margin and the variances between what actually happened and what your plan was. And you do it in that same way I showed before with using multiple dimensions by just simply dragging and dropping the icons onto the form. And it's looking at your live SyteLine data again. And then finally, the workforce planning area. This, again, uses the data that you have in SyteLine to build out a workforce plan with what people will be working in what departments, how many hours they'll be working, what their pay will be. You can do mass changes for if you're planning pay increases or cutbacks in hours, and see how that affects the total budget, how it affects the total hours. And you can plan for hires in here and see how that affects, hours and budget. So that is where I ended up planning on ending with the presentation. I think this would be a good time to then go ahead and open up for questions if you'd like to.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Steve. That was very informative. So I'm going to unmute everyone, and there should be an option for you to either raise your hand or you can type your questions into the chat lane. I do have one question that already came in for you, Steve. Will forecasting or SytePlan work with MRP?
Yes. Whether you're running SyteLine planning in the APS mode or the MRP mode makes no difference. It works with both.
And can the SytePlan workbench be done in data views?
No, it's not. It's kind of something that's it's data views on steroids actually. So yeah, data views, as you're aware, it's purely a read-only tool, whereas the workbench is actually working with data and allowing you to change it. So it is a different tool.
Okay. This one's from Rosemary. Can S&OP use accounting periods instead of calendar months?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes that whatever you have set up, that's one of the setup parameters in SytePlan, is you tell it whether to use the same fiscal periods that you use in accounting or you want to use calendar years. It's your choice.
Okay, and that applies for all items, discontinued items, and so forth. I'm sorry, does the forecast take into consideration on hand and on order for discontinued items?
Well, that's not so much a function of the forecasting. That's more of a function of the planning system. So forecasting comes up with what your demand for an item is, and then you use the, of course, the planning system for what's discontinued, what is out of stock, what is planned to be purchased. All those sort of things are, if I understand the question, are basically you telling it what the supply is, whereas the forecasting application is used to come up with what the demand is going to be. But I might not understand that question completely, so maybe we can take that one offline if you'll refer that person just to send me an email.
Yeah, and Rosemary, you are still on the line. If you'd like to speak up, I did unmute you.
Okay.
Or if you,
yeah.
Well, hi, sorry, I'm George. I'm with Rosemary. I guess
okay.
The question was mine. The question I had is when we go through the forecasts, I didn't consider the planning portion of it, but on the forecasting side, does it take into consideration the quantities you have in stock and the quantities you may have on order with a particular vendor when it does the algorithm or the horizontal or seasonality or whatever? Does it take those two factors into consideration?
No, it does not, because that's a function of the SyteLine planning system. So, I mean, that is taken into consideration. It's just not by the forecasting application. It's by, I don't know if in your company you call it the SyteLine APS, or you call it SyteLine Planning, or you call it SyteLine MRP. They all kind of mean the same thing. But the way this works is that this application develops the forecasts and then feeds those into the APS engine in SyteLine. And the APS engine considers what's on hand, what's on order, when it comes up with the suggestions that it feeds into the material planner workbench.
Okay. I have one more question, if I can. Towards the end of your presentation, I think it was 2 slides prior to ending, with the vendor and customer.
The on-time delivery?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, if I can look quickly on your presentation.
Sure. Well, I'll get that up for you.
Sorry.
Okay. Oh, that one.
Yeah, that is by vendor as well, right? You can do that by vendor, or is that?
Right. See this field right here that says customer? The partner form to this says vendor right there, so you can select from your vendor list and see on-time receipts from your vendor.
No, both, right? Delivery performance of a vendor, or just delivery performance of a customer?
Yeah, there's 2 different forms. One, they both work exactly the same. It's just that one of the forms looks at customer orders and customers, and that's the customer on-time delivery. The other form looks at purchase orders and PO receipts, and that's of course, vendor delivery performance. But as I'm saying, the forms look exactly the same. They're just looking at different data sets, and the only difference between the forms is that this field right here says vendor instead of customer on it.
Right, so we couldn't tell if a customer delivery performance was being impacted by a particular vendor.
No, because, you know, obviously when things come in from vendors, they go into inventory and get commingled with everything else.
Yeah, so we're the only company that's possibility of only.
Okay.
Yeah, I have vendor supply.
Do we have any more questions? Thank you, Steve.
Welcome.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions before we close it out? All right, well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone. I did record this, so I will send a recording of the webinar with the PowerPoint by the end of the week to all of you that participated. And keep an eye out for upcoming webinars that we will have in the next few months. Thanks again, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys, for joining.
I like these webinars. Sit there.